Have you ever looked into a dog's eyes and felt like they were trying to tell you something words never could? Today on Vale Marks, we bring you the hauntingly beautiful story of a black pit bull, soaked, chained, forgotten, who didn't just survive, she remembered. Pit bulls are one of the most misunderstood breeds, often labeled as aggressive, yet deeply loyal and intuitive. What this dog did will challenge everything you think you know. Before we dive in, please help this channel grow with a like, a share, and a subscription. Your support means the world and helps me bring you more powerful stories like this one. Stay until the end. This isn't just a story. It's a lesson in healing, in memory, and in what it means to truly choose life again. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Edmund Burke. Caleb Monroe hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to anyone in days, maybe weeks. And yet, as he turned the ignition on his weathered old truck and pulled out of the cemetery lot, the silence felt louder than ever. He had just buried his last friend. Harlan Bishop wasn't a relative or a childhood companion, but he had been consistent. Every Tuesday at 3 p.m. for nearly 6 years, they'd meet at the edge of town, on that cracked park bench near the abandoned rail tracks, to drink tea that neither of them particularly liked and talk about things that didn't really matter. Weather, gas prices, whether or not the clouds looked like something worth noticing. It wasn't the words that made it important. It was the showing up. And now, Harlan was gone. Another name etched into stone. Another face missing from the fading photos tucked into Caleb's wallet. He gripped the steering wheel with stiff fingers, the skin on his knuckles worn and papery. His eyes scanned the road ahead, but his mind wandered to the ghosts behind him. More than 10 years ago, he had lost his wife and only son in a car crash just outside of Flagstaff. The news had come in the form of flashing lights and a knock at the door, an officer's cap removed in respect, condolences offered, none of it sinking in until the funeral was over and the house stayed quiet. Too quiet. Caleb hadn't been the same man since. He had packed up the photo albums, moved out of the city, and stopped expecting anything from the world. It was easier that way. Easier than hoping. Easier than waiting for people to stay. But today, as he passed by the little park on the hill and saw that old bench standing empty, rain stains darkening the wood, something cracked open in him. Not grief. That had settled long ago like dust in his bones. This was something else. Emptiness made of sound. Silence so thick it had weight. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt like a man who didn't just live alone, but who had finally run out of people to return to. He drove slowly, letting the tires hum against the asphalt. The desert town around him blurred into muted colors. Dusty storefronts, sagging mailboxes, cacti reaching toward a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. He passed old barns, rusted trucks, and stretches of brittle grass pressed flat by years of wind. The kind of forgotten landscape that seemed to sigh with every breeze. Then he heard it. A sound. At first it was so faint he thought it might be a branch tapping against a fence post, or maybe the echo of his own tires on gravel. But as he slowed near a sharp bend in the road, the sound returned. Sharper this time. Metal against metal. Tap, tap, tap. Caleb's brow furrowed. He rolled down the window halfway. The breeze carried the scent of old hay and something else. Wet iron and earth. He scanned the roadside and spotted it. An old farmstead just beyond the fence, the roof sagging, weeds tall enough to hide half the structure. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, like a photograph left out in the sun too long. But the sound was coming from there, that rhythmic, desperate clicking, like claws against iron. He shouldn't stop. He told himself that. It wasn't his business. There were people paid to handle these kinds of things. And yet, he found himself pulling over anyway. The truck creaked as he stepped out, his boots pressing into the damp dirt. The air had grown still, thick with a quiet tension that felt out of place in such an empty place. As he approached the old gate, he could see more clearly now. Behind a crumbling shed and beneath the skeletal frame of what might have once been a chicken coop, there was a rusted metal kennel. And inside it, movement. Caleb's breath caught. A dog. A Pitbull by the looks of it. Jet black, with ribs sharp beneath stretched skin. The dog wasn't barking, wasn't growling. It was barely moving, lying flat with one paw extended, the other curled under its chest. But its eyes, those eyes met his through the gaps in the rusted metal. And suddenly the tapping made sense. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't a random sound. It was the dog's paw, weakly hitting the cage door. Again and again. Just enough to be heard. A sound not loud enough to startle, just loud enough to ask, "Are you there?" Caleb stood frozen, heart thudding. The air felt thick now, not with fear, but with something worse. Recognition. He didn't know this dog, but he knew that look, that quiet, patient plea. The kind you give when you've stopped expecting rescue, but still have the tiniest flicker of hope that someone might see you. Might care enough to stop. He had seen it in the mirror too many times. The dog's body was filthy. One leg was tethered by a short, frayed rope to a rusted table leg inside the kennel. There was no food, no water bowl, just mud, flies, and silence. Caleb stepped forward, slow and deliberate, hands low at his sides. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't flinch, just watched him, quiet, still. And Caleb realized something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He couldn't leave. He couldn't get back into that truck, drive away and pretend this hadn't happened. He didn't have it in him, because the truth was, he needed saving too. And maybe, just maybe, this forgotten pit bull, abandoned in a cage at the edge of a dying town, was the first voice in a long time that reminded him how to listen. Caleb exhaled slowly and reached for the latch. The gate let out a slow metallic groan as Caleb pushed it open with the edge of his boot. Rust flaked away from the hinges, falling like orange snow onto the gravel below. The scent of wet dirt, mildew, and something else, fainter but unmistakably sour, drifted into his nose and made his chest tighten. He moved cautiously across the overgrown lot, the soles of his boots crunching over broken glass and patches of gravel swallowed by moss. The sky was darkening behind him, a thin veil of gray rolling across the horizon like smoke. He didn't have a flashlight, but he didn't need one. He followed the silence. And there, beyond a collapsed fence and behind a warped wooden shed, he found it. A cage. Not one of those shiny kennels you'd see at a pet shop with fresh blankets and chew toys. This was an iron prison, welded from repurposed fencing and rusted steel, its corners jagged, its roof patched with torn tarp and bungee cords. The floor was caked in mud. Bits of bones, old food wrappers, and rotted straw lay scattered in the corners like debris from a storm that no one had bothered to clean. Inside, curled into a corner barely large enough to hold him, was a dog. A pit bull. Black as coal, coated in grime, ribs outlined stark beneath taut skin. He wasn't standing. He wasn't even sitting. He was lying down, head resting against the bars, eyes half-lidded. Not in sleep, but in surrender. Caleb stood still. For a moment he did nothing. Didn't speak, didn't breathe, just observed. The dog didn't react. No bark, no growl, no flinch. He simply blinked, slowly, like a dying fire fading into ash. One paw was stretched out against the metal, the pad raw, its claws worn to uneven stubs. The other front leg was twisted awkwardly, bound by a chain no more than a foot long to the rusted base of what used to be a bed frame, now a skeleton of twisted pipes and bolts. There were bruises on the dog's face, small round ones just beneath his eye. One had turned a sickly yellow, another still a faint purple beneath the fur. His stomach had hollowed into a pit, his breathing shallow, more whisper than inhale. Caleb's mouth tightened. He felt something in his chest clench. Not pity, recognition. He knew what it looked like when a living thing had given up. Not just from his years as a firefighter, pulling bodies from wreckage and floods. This was something he knew on a personal level. The stillness of it. The absence of fear or resistance. Not because danger had passed, but because there was no energy left to feel anything at all. He'd worn that look in the mirror once, not long after burying his wife and son. It had taken years to see a person again in his own reflection. And now, here it was again, on 4 legs in a cage behind a dying barn. He knelt slowly, careful not to move too fast. The dog's eyes flicked toward him but showed no change, no concern, only tired awareness. "I don't have anything for you," Caleb said softly, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "No food, no water, no reason for you to trust me." Still, he reached out. He placed his hand just outside the bars, palm facing up. The dog didn't move for several seconds. Then, almost imperceptibly, his head shifted forward. Not much. Just enough for his nose to brush Caleb's fingertips. The touch was so faint it could have been mistaken for a breeze. But it was real. And then came the lick. A single, slow sweep of a tongue so dry it felt like sandpaper. It wasn't eager. It wasn't desperate. It was quiet, hesitant. A gesture not of need, but of apology. As if the dog was saying, "I'm sorry I'm still here." Caleb felt his throat tighten. His knees ached from kneeling, but he didn't move. He let his hand rest there, felt the dog's warmth, faint but present. No one had come for him. That much was clear, and Caleb knew why he hadn't turned back, why he'd stopped, why he couldn't walk away. He glanced at the chain. It was bolted to the frame, corroded, barely hanging on. Caleb pulled a small tool from the glove box of his truck, a pair of pliers he used to keep for fixing fencing. It took effort. The metal resisted like it was clinging to its prisoner. But eventually, it gave. The dog didn't move, didn't struggle. When the final piece of chain fell to the ground with a dull clink, he lifted his head, just barely, and nudged Caleb's arm. It wasn't a thank you. It was acknowledgement. Caleb unzipped his jacket, shrugged it off, and wrapped the dog in it the best he could. The fabric swallowed the dog's frail frame with room to spare. Gently, slowly, he lifted him. The weight startled him, not because it was heavy, but because it wasn't. This was a creature that had once been strong, vibrant. You could see it in his build, his frame, and now he was light as an old coat, bones and breath. He laid the dog on the passenger seat of his truck, tucking the jacket around him like a sleeping bag. The dog didn't resist. He just sighed. A sound so human it made Caleb freeze for a second. As he climbed into the driver's seat, Caleb looked at him again. The dog blinked, his head resting on the folded jacket, eyes fluttering between exhaustion and something else. Something very close to trust. Caleb stared out the windshield, hands resting on the steering wheel. The rain had started again, gentle this time, tapping the roof like distant footsteps. He didn't know where they were going. He didn't know what came next. But as he glanced at the broken animal beside him, he whispered, "We're both alone, you and me. No one left. No promises. No destination." He started the engine, the truck rumbling to life. "But I'm not leaving you behind. Not tonight." And with that, they drove off. 2 souls, both forgotten in their own way, headed toward nowhere in particular, but not alone anymore. The rain had returned, soft and steady, like fingers tapping gently against the windshield. Caleb kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly on the jacket-wrapped form beside him. The Pitbull, frail, silent, barely breathing, hadn't stirred since they left the abandoned farm behind. He hadn't planned anything beyond this moment. He didn't know where the nearest open clinic was or what kind of care the dog would need. He only knew he couldn't leave him behind to die in that cage, chained to rust and silence. But then, as the truck rounded a bend, something shifted. A sound. Small at first. A low, broken whimper. It came not from pain, but from something deeper, something urgent. The dog stirred beneath the jacket, lifting his head just enough to look back through the rain-smeared rear window. He whimpered again, this time louder. Then stared at Caleb, locking eyes with a look that was unmistakable. It wasn't about himself, it was a call. Caleb's hands froze on the steering wheel. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew. Without another thought, he eased the truck onto the shoulder, turned on the hazard lights, and made a slow U-turn back toward the decaying property they had just left. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the truck crawled past the rusted gate and rolled to a stop in the same spot where he'd parked just minutes earlier. The Pitbull, who hadn't moved since Caleb lifted him from the cage, suddenly pushed weakly at the edge of the passenger seat as if trying to rise. His body trembled from the effort, but his gaze was fixed on the small shed behind the kennel, his breath quickening. Something was still in there. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the mud. The rain had lightened, but the air carried that dense metallic chill that often came after trauma. He passed the cage where he had found the dog and moved toward the rear corner of the choy, where warped boards leaned against one another like forgotten memories. The door had no lock, just a nail twisted through a loop of wire. It took a tug to get it loose. The door creaked open with a moan like a wounded animal. Inside, it was darker than he remembered. The flashlight beam danced across the rotting interior, molded insulation, fallen shingles, cracked buckets. The floor was littered with straw, some of it fresh, some long decayed. And then he heard it, a rustle, so faint he might have missed it if he hadn't been holding his breath. He swept the beam low and caught sight of movement near the far wall. Two small shapes. Huddled beneath a collapsed shelf, nestled in the straw, were two puppies, both pit bulls. One, white with a spot over its left eye, blinked at the light but didn't move. The other, brindled and smaller, cowered behind its sibling, trembling. Caleb stepped forward slowly, crouching down. His knees creaked in protest. "Hey there," he whispered. "It's okay. I see you." The white one blinked again, then let out a small cough, a dry, rattling sound that made Caleb's heart twist. He moved closer and saw what the shadows had hidden. The brindled puppy's left eye was clouded, blind. The white one had a gash across its rear leg, dried blood crusted around the fur. They weren't crying, weren't yelping. They were too weak. He reached out slowly. The white one flinched, but didn't pull away. He scooped them both into his arms, their tiny bodies shockingly light and cold. As he backed out of the shed, careful not to jostle them, he felt movement beside him. Diesel, still wrapped in Caleb's coat, had pulled himself halfway out of the truck's open door and was now trying to step down. His limbs shook with effort, but he was determined. Caleb rushed over, placing the puppies gently on the front seat, then helped the dog back inside. Diesel didn't look at Caleb. His eyes were locked on the two small bundles of fur now curled into one another, shivering. He leaned down, slow and deliberate, and pressed his nose against each puppy, first the blind one, then the wounded one, then again, like he was checking, confirming, counting. When he was done, he settled beside them, resting his head over their small bodies like a living blanket. It was the first time Caleb saw him relax, not in a way that meant comfort, but purpose. Diesel wasn't just surviving anymore. He was protecting something. Caleb stood outside the truck for a long moment, watching the three of them through the rain-blurred glass. Something tugged inside his chest. It wasn't sorrow, not exactly. It wasn't pity either. It was heavier than that, fuller. These weren't just animals. They weren't just survivors. They were a family. and somehow, in the quiet space of that truck cab, he was becoming part of it. He opened the driver's door, slid back into the seat, and looked down at the three figures nestled beside him. "I guess we don't leave anyone behind tonight," he murmured. He reached across the seat, tucking the jacket more securely around all three, and started the engine again. The puppies whimpered softly, but not in fear. Diesel licked the smaller one's head once, then closed his eyes. As the truck rolled back onto the road, Caleb glanced at the rearview mirror. Not to look back, but to leave it behind for good. In his arms, for the first time in over a decade, something warm flickered in his chest. Not just a heartbeat, but a reason for it. And this time, it didn't feel borrowed or fading. It felt like the beginning of something worth carrying forward. The next morning, the sun rose over the desert hills with that dry, golden light that made everything look older, wiser, maybe, but never softer. Caleb sat behind the wheel of his truck, one hand curled tightly around a coffee cup that had long gone cold, the other resting on the steering wheel, unmoving. In the passenger seat, Diesel lay curled under the jacket Caleb had used to carry him the night before. His breathing was shallow but steady. The two puppies, whom Caleb had wrapped in an old flannel shirt, slept in a small cardboard box wedged safely between two towels. One whimpered occasionally in its sleep, but otherwise the cab was still. Caleb didn't know where to go. A veterinarian, that was obvious. But not just any vet, not someone who would ask too many questions, demand forms, or recommend a trip to the county shelter where dogs like Diesel didn't stand much of a chance. He remembered a name, Harper Jameson. Years ago, she'd been the one to patch up a neighbor's dog after a nasty fencing injury. Caleb had gone with him, mostly out of boredom. He didn't recall much about the visit, just that the clinic smelled like antiseptic and cedarwood, and that the woman running it didn't talk much. But when she did, people listened. He followed the road out past the gas station, then onto a long stretch of gravel that wound between flat fields of wild sage and rusty barbed wire. A hand-painted sign, barely visible from the road, read, "Harper Jameson, DVM, by appointment or emergency only." Caleb figured this qualified. The building looked more like an old farmhouse than a clinic. Its wood siding had faded to a pale gray, and a wind chime made of silver spoons jingled gently in the breeze by the front porch. There were no other cars. Just a dented Subaru parked under the shade of a dying juniper tree. He stepped out slowly, joints stiff from a long night. When he opened the truck door, Diesel lifted his head slightly. Caleb reached over, brushing the dog's ears gently. "Hang in there, boy." He carried the box of puppies in first, then came back for Diesel, moving carefully, one hand supporting the dog's back, the other under his chest. The Pitbull didn't resist. He simply leaned into Caleb's touch like it was the only thing tethering him to this world. As he approached the porch, the front door opened. Harper stood in the doorway wearing worn jeans, a loose button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a pair of thick boots streaked with mud. Her auburn hair was tied back in a no-nonsense braid, and her eyes, pale gray, almost silver, scanned the scene in one quiet sweep. She didn't say hello, didn't ask what had happened. Instead, she stepped aside. "Bring them in." The examination room was quiet, no fluorescent lights humming overhead, just warm lamplight, the smell of coffee and pine soap, and shelves lined with jars of cotton, gauze, and homemade dog biscuits. Harper moved with precision. She didn't rush, but she didn't waste time either. She checked the puppies first, murmuring to them in a voice low enough it felt like part of the air. She cleaned their eyes, touched their limbs, and took their temperatures. "They're dehydrated, malnourished, but not beyond saving," she said simply. Then she turned to Diesel. She didn't flinch at his scars, didn't hesitate when she touched the bruises along his rib cage or the welt near his spine. She worked silently, her face unreadable. Caleb watched her fingers pause just beneath Diesel's belly. She pressed gently, then leaned in with a small pen light. A moment later, she looked up at Caleb. "Did you know he's marked?" Caleb shook his head. "What do you mean?" She moved Diesel slightly and pointed. There, faint, but still visible under the grime and scarring, was a thin, circular brand, burned into the skin just above his inner thigh. "Illegal trainers sometimes use symbols like this," Harper said, voice quiet, "to tag dogs in a fighting circuit. That one's been altered, probably covered with chemicals to try to make it fade, but it's still there." She didn't ask where Caleb had found him, didn't launch into a lecture or start writing down details for animal control. Instead, she stood, grabbed a metal basin, and began mixing warm water with a bottle of antiseptic. "Sit down," she told Caleb. "He'll rest easier if you're close." So he sat and watched. She cleaned the wounds one by one, stitched the torn skin, applied ointment to the burned paw pads. She moved like someone who'd done this hundreds of times, but without numbness. There was a softness in her silence, a reverence in her touch. And when Diesel let out a soft groan during the final bandage, Harper paused, just long enough to whisper, "I know. I know." When it was done, she covered the table with a soft fleece blanket and gently helped Diesel lie down. The two puppies had already fallen asleep in a heated crate nearby. Harper peeled off her gloves and looked at Caleb for the first time. "You keeping them?" she asked. Caleb hesitated. "I don't know yet." She nodded, walked to the back room, returned with 3 foam cushions, still wrapped in plastic. "Take these. They'll sleep easier off the floor." No questions, no judgments, no speeches about responsibility or planning ahead. Just this: what do they need? And then, what can I offer? Caleb stood awkwardly in the doorway, cushions under one arm. "Thank you," he said finally. Harper just nodded. "If you change your mind, I'll help place them. But something tells me you won't." He almost smiled. Almost. They didn't talk about kindness that day, or about pain or fate or rescue. They just looked at the same broken things and decided not to turn away, because some wounds don't need answers. They just need someone to stay. It started with a hesitation, just a small one. Every time they passed that stretch of road, where the cracked fence leaned and the thistle grew wild, Diesel would slow his pace. He never growled, never barked, but his steps would grow heavier, more deliberate. His ears would tilt back slightly, and his eyes would lock on something in the distance. At first, Caleb thought it was a fluke. Maybe Diesel smelled a coyote, or remembered the fear of that first night, tangled in rust and silence. But then it happened again, and again, day after day, at the same spot. And each time, the air between them grew stiller, more charged. Caleb wasn't a man prone to signs or superstition, but he'd learned over the years to respect instinct, especially in creatures who'd survived more than they should have. So one morning, instead of walking past, he stopped. Diesel paused too, looking up at him, then back toward the trees. "All right," Caleb said softly. "Lead the way." The Pitbull moved ahead, not with excitement, but purpose. His limp was more noticeable now with the damp morning air, but he pressed forward, weaving through tall grass and cracked branches, following a path only he seemed to know. Behind the skeletal remains of a half-collapsed shed, Diesel stopped. He sniffed at the ground, then began to paw at the earth. Caleb crouched beside him, brushing aside leaves, sticks, and rotted tarp. That's when he saw it. A square of rusted metal, flat against the ground, nearly invisible beneath layers of decay. A makeshift hatch, its corners warped, one side still held down by a loose hinge. Caleb's breath caught. He reached for the handle and pulled. The hatch creaked open, releasing a breath of air that was too cold for the day. The scent was unmistakable. Wet concrete, rust, and the lingering trace of something old and ugly. He grabbed a flashlight from his jacket pocket and aimed it into the darkness. Stairs. Crumbling cement steps leading down into the earth, swallowed by shadows. He looked at Diesel. The dog had sat down now, perfectly still, watching, waiting. Caleb descended slowly, his boots slipping slightly on the moss-covered stone. The air was damp and thick, clinging to his skin like mist. As the beam of light swept across the walls, the picture came into focus. Cages, rows of them, stacked and bolted. Most were empty now, just skeletons of confinement. The floor was strewn with shredded rope, chewed collars, and broken clips. In the corner, a metal table lay on its side, legs twisted, smeared with what looked like old blood now faded into rusty brown. But it was the wall that stopped him cold. Tacked up in rows, protected under yellowing plastic sheets, were pages from a binder. Documents, each bearing a name, a code, a short description. Series C09, male, high drive, sold series B14, female, skittish, discarded series D12, female, aggressive but quiet, $1,200, rejected. Caleb's eyes locked on that last entry, Diesel. He didn't need the name to know. The code matched the faint tattoo Harper had found. The description, the temperament, the price, the final verdict, spelled out in detached handwriting. It was a sales catalog for living things. Caleb felt the flashlight tremble in his grip. This place hadn't just been a holding area, it had been a system, organized, cold, efficient, and somewhere in the middle of all that cruelty, Diesel had been just another line item, another misfit, rejected for not being violent enough. He staggered back a step, pressing his hand against the wall to steady himself. Above him the wind shifted, leaves rustled. He climbed back up into the light, heart pounding. Diesel was waiting at the edge of the hatch, sitting quietly. He didn't wag his tail, didn't approach. He simply looked up at Caleb, those amber eyes steady, calm, unflinching. And Caleb saw it. This wasn't a cry for help, not anymore. It was a memory shared, a truth offered. Diesel hadn't led him here to beg for comfort. He had brought him to bear witness, to what he'd endured, to what he'd survived. Caleb dropped to one knee, placing a hand gently on Diesel's shoulder. The dog leaned in, just slightly. "I'm sorry," Caleb murmured, the words falling like stones in the quiet. Diesel didn't respond. He didn't need to. They stood there in silence, two survivors beside a hole in the earth where monsters once walked, and neither of them turned away, not this time. It was just after noon when the black SUV rolled up the dusty road, its sleek frame and polished chrome out of place against the weathered fence and gravel drive. Caleb had just finished refilling the water bowls near the porch when he saw the vehicle stop. The engine cut out. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a tailored gray jacket, crisp slacks, polished boots that had never met a farm field in their life. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced around with faint distaste, then opened the back door and pulled out a slim leather folder. Caleb knew the type, not just because of the clothes or the practiced calm in the way he walked, but because of the expression, calculated, performative, like someone who had spent years getting what he wanted by talking just the right amount. "Good afternoon," the man said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for a dog. Well, 3 actually." Caleb didn't respond. The man continued, his voice smooth as silk. "I believe they were picked up near Route 12 a little over a week ago. A black Pitbull and 2 pups. I have their paperwork right here." He held up the folder, tapping it once for effect. "My name is Blake Mercer. They're registered under my training facility's contract. I'm here to collect them." Before Caleb could speak, the screen door creaked open behind him. Harper stepped onto the porch with her phone already in hand, recording. She didn't say a word. Just stood next to Caleb, eyes fixed on the man in the driveway. Blake faltered, just slightly. Then, from around the side of the house, a shadow moved. Diesel. He stepped into view, his gait slow but steady, the scar above his leg still visible beneath his coat. He didn't run forward, didn't bark. He didn't need to. He just stood there, head high, eyes locked onto the man in the driveway. Blake's voice tightened. That's him. That's my dog. He was part of a special obedience program. Valuable lineage, misunderstood temperament. He took a step forward. Diesel didn't move, but something in the air shifted. A presence, a weight. Because this time, Diesel wasn't cowering. He wasn't leashed or cornered or clinging to survival. He was standing his ground. And the look in his eyes wasn't fear. It was recognition and judgment. Blake's smile twitched. Look, I have the documents. I'm not here to cause trouble. But those animals belong to me. Caleb stepped in front of Diesel, calm and deliberate. You lost that claim the moment you left them to die in a cage, Blake scoffed. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what I saw, Harper cut in. I've treated the wounds. I've read the microchip records, and I've documented every scar on this dog's body. She lowered the phone slightly. So has the sheriff's office. Blake glanced around now, suddenly aware of the silence, how thick and watchful it had become. Behind Diesel, the two puppies had peeked out from behind a porch post, tiny and quiet, but wide-eyed. And around them, the stillness, not just from the animals, but from the people, from the land, from the weight of truth finally allowed to breathe. Blake took a step back. This isn't over, he muttered. No, Caleb said, voice quiet but unwavering. But for them, the worst part is. Blake looked one last time at Diesel, perhaps expecting the dog to lower his eyes or back away. But Diesel didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, tall and still, unbending. Sometimes, Caleb thought, the silence of a survivor carried more weight than a scream ever could. Blake turned and walked briskly to the SUV. Gravel sprayed under the tires as he peeled away, swallowed by the horizon. Back on the porch, Caleb exhaled slowly. He turned to Diesel and placed a hand on the dog's head, gentle and steady. You don't owe him fear anymore. Harper stepped closer, looking toward the road, then back at Caleb. You okay? He nodded. I wasn't just standing up for them, he said. I think I needed to prove to myself that I could still stand up for something. Diesel sat beside him, close enough to touch, his eyes soft again, not broken, just unafraid. Together they watched the dust settle, and behind them, a new kind of peace took root, one that didn't forget the past, but didn't let it win either. The phone call came just after breakfast. Caleb was on the porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching Luna chase butterflies while Bruno, the three-legged rascal, tried to dig a hole under the fence he'd already been caught escaping twice. Diesel lay nearby, calm as ever, his head resting on Caleb's boot, his amber eyes tracking every movement in the yard with quiet authority. Harper stepped outside, her phone still in hand. She didn't look at him right away. It was the shelter, she said finally. They're checking in, said it might be time to consider options. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to ask what kind of options. She sat beside him, handing over a manila folder. Inside were names, addresses, and smiling faces, families eager to adopt. Photos of children holding tennis balls, backyards with white fences, testimonials promising love, care, and long walks under blue skies. They mean well, Harper said softly. Some of these homes are good, better equipped, more stable. He nodded, slowly closing the folder. That night, Caleb didn't sleep in his bed. He hadn't for weeks. Instead, he curled up on an old quilt in the sunroom, a space now half covered in paw prints and chewed corners. Luna stretched out against his back like a warm blanket. Bruno snored by the window, occasionally twitching as if chasing dreams. Diesel, ever vigilant, rested with his back to the door, ears relaxed but alert. Caleb lay there, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of breathing around him, the rise and fall of lungs that had once fought for air in darker places. And he knew. These dogs hadn't chosen violence. Someone else had. Someone had decided they were tools, bred, trained, and pushed toward aggression. And yet, despite everything, they'd survived. They'd found trust again. Found him. So the next morning, when Harper asked what he wanted to do, Caleb simply said, "They were chosen once to fight, to hurt, to be feared. I want them to be chosen now, to live." It was Harper's idea to give it a name. They sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper between them, tossing out words. Nothing too soft, nothing too polished. These dogs didn't come from polished places. They were rough-edged, bruised, a little broken, but not beaten. Caleb wrote 2 words and circled them. Iron Heart. Because that's what it felt like. Strength forged through fire. And so, Iron Heart Refuge was born. Not long after, the barn was cleared, repainted, and reinforced. Fencing went up. Donations trickled in, mostly from people Harper had worked with over the years. They started small, taking in dogs that other shelters had given up on. Dogs that had histories that came with warnings. But here, there were no labels. Just names. Diesel was the first to welcome each new arrival. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He simply walked up, sat nearby, and waited. Sometimes that was all it took. The trembling stopped. The growling faded. Just knowing he was there made the others believe safety was possible. Luna found her rhythm in a different way. She gravitated toward people, especially the veterans Harper invited through her trauma recovery network, soldiers who had come home with invisible scars. Luna would sit beside them during group therapy sessions, resting her head on their laps, offering the kind of comfort no human could imitate. And Bruno? Well, Bruno was chaos wrapped in fur. Missing a leg didn't slow him down one bit. He had a gift for stealing gloves, untying bootlaces, and knocking over water bowls exactly when Harper finished mopping the floor. But he also made people laugh, and sometimes laughter was the first thing a broken spirit needed. As weeks turned to months, the refuge became more than just a rescue. It became a home. There were quiet mornings filled with soft snoring and slow coffee, afternoons of brushing coats, repairing fences, and watching Bruno wrestle with a broom he believed was alive. Evenings spent under string lights, where volunteers gathered around the fire pit while Diesel lay nearby, content and watchful. And Caleb, he was changing too, not loudly. Not all at once, but in the little things. The way he hummed while feeding the pups. The way he knelt to check a scraped paw, murmuring reassurances without realizing. The way his eyes no longer held the same weight when he looked at tomorrow. He wasn't waiting to disappear anymore. He was building something. One evening, Harper found him sitting beside Diesel near the garden. She sat beside him, resting her arm lightly against his. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "You started out thinking you were rescuing them?" Caleb smiled faintly, scratching Diesel's ears. "They rescued me first." They sat in silence for a while, the stars bright overhead, the wind soft across the fields. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, Caleb understood something he'd never quite put into words before. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the ones who crawl into your life, scarred and silent, and decide to stay. Sometimes it's the ones who don't ask for much, just that you don't turn away. And sometimes all it takes to start again is 3 dogs, a broken past, and the choice to love anyway. Because in the end, home isn't where you begin. It's where you choose to stay. So, was it fate, memory, or something deeper that led her back to that hidden place beneath the earth? One thing's certain, this wasn't just a rescue. It was a reckoning. For the ones who were thrown away, for the ones who waited in silence, for the ones who were finally seen. At Vale Marks, we believe that family isn't who you're born to. It's who walks with you through the storm and doesn't let go. Caleb didn't just save Diesel, she saved him right back. And together, they built something bigger than rescue. They built home. If this story touched something in you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Let's reach 1,000 strong and keep bringing light to the shadows, one story at a time. Because sometimes, a single act of compassion can rewrite an entire life.